So a family would be sleeping?
Family would be sleeping there.
Well, I feel sometimes like I'm dealing with similar conditions to the English working class in the 1870s or the 1780s, for example, where you had 20 people in a room and an open sewer in the middle of the court and people dealing with terrible infectious diseases that killed them early and addictive behaviours from the dispossession that the English working class went through at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
In 2007, Prime Minister John Howard and his Minister Mal Brough declared a state of emergency in the Northern Territory, but they applied it only to black Australians.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr Brough and I have called this news conference to announce a number of major measures to deal with what we can only describe as a national emergency in relation to the abuse of children in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory.
Known as the intervention, its aim, they said, was to save Aboriginal children from pedophiles, but there was a hidden agenda.
It is interventionist. It does push aside the role of the Territory to some degree. I accept that, but what matters more? The constitutional niceties or the care and protection of young children?
The intervention was launched on a very cynical big lie, a vicious one that smeared all Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory because the Minister for Indigenous Affairs at the time, Mal Brough, said there were pedophile rings in all of these communities that the federal government was going to occupy. An extraordinary sweeping claim. The legislation that delivered the intervention, this federal takeover, doesn't actually mention children, but the propaganda machine from the beginning was relentless.
Everybody in those communities knows who runs the pedophile rings. They know who brings in the petrol. They know who sell the ganja. They need to be taken out of the community and dealt with.
An extraordinary sweeping claim. If we were going to be saving the children, we couldn't have any of the recommendations about talking to the Aboriginal organisations or consulting Aboriginal people or even asking the Aboriginal families, well, what is the status of these children? It was time to send in the troops.
It scared the living daylights out of everybody. It really did. The mothers thought their children was going to be taken away and they bolted. Everybody left this community.
So the army just rolled in their trucks and pitched their tents in the middle of the community.
Yes, here, right
The Australian Army in an Australian
Yes.
Aboriginal community.
Yes. All these soldiers. We were being attacked.
For the first time in modern Australia, the army was sent into black communities as the spearhead of a government determined to control people's lives and their land. Fear and shock overwhelmed communities. People who refused to hand over the lease of their lands were to be denied basic services like decent housing and sanitation. A government job scheme that employed thousands in remote areas was all but eliminated. Benefits and pensions were restricted, and people could only buy essentials with a special basics card. Only black citizens were treated this way. As people's incomes were quarantined, starvation was reported. The government's own review committee found what it called a collective despair among Aboriginal people. The rate of self-harm and attempted suicide quadrupled. Laying the ground for the intervention was a lurid media campaign led by a national TV program called Lateline. Lateline claimed that Aboriginal children were the victims of sex slavery. The programme's allegations centred on the community of Mutijulu. A key witness was this man, whose identity was disguised. They called him a former youth worker.
The people who are in control are the drug dealers and the petrol warlords and the pedophiles.
There was no sex slavery, no petrol warlords, no pedophile rings. The anonymous witness was actually a senior government official who had worked in Mutijulu but never lived there. The Late Line program was exposed by investigative journalist Chris Graham, founder of the National Indigenous Times.
In 2006, Late Line began reporting that sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities was rampant and that Aboriginal men were violent and beating and abusing women and children on a scale that can't be believed. And it was that style of extraordinary sensationalist reporting that paved the way for the federal government to introduce policies that, frankly, Australians haven't seen.
I mean, the anonymous youth worker, in fact, was this government official called Gregory Andrews. And he claimed that he'd actually lived there for 7 months.
He hadn't lived there a single night. He'd never stayed overnight in Mutijulu in his life.
I've been told by a number of people of men in the region who go to other communities and get young girls and bring them back to their community and keep them there as sex slaves.
The funniest thing was seeing Greg Andrews, or seeing this man in a hat and a jumper that I knew was his hat and his jumper, and seeing him sitting there talking in this robotic voice about stuff that he'd known about this community or seemingly known about this community. And I'm sitting there watching going, is that Greg? And it was.
And who did you know Greg to be?
So Greg Andrews was my boss in the Office of Indigenous Policy Coordination. He was the Assistant Secretary, the branch manager.
So he was a senior government official?
Yes, yes.
He made all sorts of bizarre claims. He made a claim that he knew of, or he had heard of, children being held in communities against their will and traded amongst communities by Aboriginal men as sex slaves. He claimed that he'd seen women coming to meetings with broken arms and screwdrivers and other implements hanging out of their legs.
Was there any substance at all in any of these claims?
Zero. I mean, none at all.
I asked the man in the hat, Gregory Andrews, for an interview, but he declined. The Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Mal Brough, looking at the evidence, quote unquote, that the program had produced about so-called paedophile rings, said that child abuse was happening in unthinkable numbers. Extraordinary thing to say, wasn't it?
Extraordinary, particularly in the context that he knew the anonymous former youth worker on the ABC program was actually his advisor.
To me, that was indicative of a complete lack of good faith in the production of the program, because if they couldn't get someone more objective than that, it must, to those who were making the program, have made them at least think that there was a possible problem, more than a possible problem, and yet they just went ahead with it.
The Australian Crime Commission, which you set up and gave special powers to, found no evidence. The Northern Territory Police found no evidence. Umpteen reports since then, frankly, have found no evidence.
Well,
and I'll reel them off to you if you'd like.
Feel free. Factually incorrect. So what they have found is that
the Australian Crime Commission were lying? The Northern Territory Police had got it wrong? Is that it?
The reality is that when they went into these communities, they couldn't find the people that would substantiate the evidence. They will tell you that there is any amount of inescapable evidence, such as STD of children at a very young age, and I have personally spoken to parents and relatives who can identify the individuals, but they won't.
You accused Aboriginal communities, and all Aboriginal communities, not just Mutijulu, of harbouring paedophile rings.
First of all, there was an independent report put together by the Northern Territory Labor government. They visited 45 distinct separate Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, and they found evidence of child sexual abuse in every single community.
Mr. Brough totally, completely misrepresented little children as sacred and used it in a very crude way to his own ends. Why would the minister want to say such a thing? Because it's just not true. I don't understand. The report did not point to pedophiles or pedophile rings or, dozens of people roaming around sort of abusing children. It wasn't that kind of report at all. We wrote what people told us about and all the concerns that they have. So they spoke to us about poverty, they spoke to us about kids not going to school, young mothers, a lack of education for everybody, lack of housing, unemployment. When certain conditions like that exist, the likelihood of the abuse of children happening, it's very likely.
The neglect and abuse of children is undeniable. Those facts were lost. The importance of the propaganda by the television programs was to create a situation in which the government could act to control those communities.
You put up pretty provocative signs in these prescribed Aboriginal areas. Would you put up the same signs here on the Gold Coast in Queensland? Would you put those signs up in places where there is child abuse, middle class Australia, working class Australia, white Australia?
It's a really good question, because what you're actually pointing to is that we should not discriminate about colour, but we should be actually protecting children, regardless of where they are.
Yes.
Let me tell you, I live here on the Sunshine Coast, and there is child sexual abuse here. That's quite okay. And right here, there is no doubt child sexual abuse. It's not exclusive right of one particular ethnicity or one location.
So in 2008, the Central Australian group of specialists put together a report around the intervention. And I suppose one of the major things that we found and we wanted to make clear to the government was that after 11,000 health checks of children that had been performed, there was only one child who was found with a health condition that wasn't otherwise known. And that wasn't a sexual assault case. So if Mal Brough wants to dismiss this report written by experts in their field working on the ground, then I suppose he can, but his dismissal is false.
Why did Gregory Andrews appear anonymously? This is a man who, in effect, worked for you. Why did he appear on the ABC's Late Line programme calling himself, or them calling him, an anonymous youth worker? Why did that happen?
I don't know why you would put the question to me, because
didn't he brief you before that?
No.
He didn't brief you?
No.